So good afternoon and welcome all to the seminar series of Decolonizing Post-Migration. Thank you for joining us today. As you know, these seminars are recorded. So if you wish to remain unrecognized, so please switch off your camera, and you can also change your name. For the fourth seminar, we are very delighted to have Dr. Lucy Mayblin as a guest speaker, who is going to present us a talk about Asylum After Empire. Dr. Lucy Mayblin talk is going to last around 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes Q&A and discussion. But before this, Tesfilm is going to introduce Dr. Lucy Mayblin, her most prominent work.
Thank you, Saad, and hello everyone. So just do a bit of a brief introduction to Dr. Lucy. So Dr. Lucy is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Sheffield. Her research mainly focuses on asylum, human rights, policy making, and legacies of colonialism. She is the author of 3 books: Asylum After Empire, Postcolonial Legacies in the Politics of Asylum Seeking, Impoverishment and Asylum, Social Policy as Slow Violence, and her recent work with Jordan Migration Studies and Colonialism. She was recently awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize for her research achievements in the area of asylum and migration. Lucy's work has also been published in a wide range of journals, including Sociology, Migration Studies, the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Economy and Society, and Citizenship Studies. Without further ado, Lucy, I would say thank you very much for accepting our invitation and giving a talk today. So I would like to invite you to our virtual floor today.
Thank you. Okay, and let me just sort out this screen sharing. My slides are only indicative; they're not elaborate. So, okay, I think I've worked out. Okay, so, doesn't like that. Sorry, I'm moving between screens, and I think that will have to be looking slightly away from the camera. Okay. So I'm sorry for not looking directly at the camera, but thank you so much for inviting me, Tesfilm. It's a real honor to be part of this series. And I think that the fact that the series even exists is a testament to how much things have changed in recent years. So when I was first working on the relationship between colonialism and asylum from around 2009 onwards, I'd often be met with just utter bafflement that I would be studying such a strange and obscure topic that was perceived to be so far from the contemporary crises and challenges of today. And that I now get accused of working on this because it's fashionable is testament to how much things have changed, I think. But of course, the accusation that spending serious time contemplating how 500 years of colonialism could have shaped the present is a fad that will pass is, of course, another kind of dismissal and silencing of the significance of those legacies, I think. So Tesfilm has asked me to give a talk about my 2017 book, Asylum After Empire, and I'm conscious this is quite old now, and I've written 2 other books since then, but I'm just getting in early and saying, right, early on, that it's not my fault. He asked me to give a talk about this older work. So hopefully that I can be forgiven for that. So the project that became my book, Asylum After Empire, with that project, I started, as many of us do, with a relatively simple observation and question. So in the UK, we have an asylum policy regime which explicitly tries to prevent potential asylum seekers from arriving on British soil, because then they will have the right to apply for asylum. And people who do manage to make it here face an asylum system designed to minimize their chances of being recognized as a refugee. In the current regime, and I'm going to talk a little bit more later about the new proposals, But in the current regime, people are forced to live in squalid housing or banned from working and live in poverty on welfare support payments, which are less than the income of the poorest 10% of the British population. They're arbitrarily detained, adults and children, and if their application for asylum is rejected, some are forcibly deported. Some people call this the non-entree regime, but Theresa May called it the hostile environment. The largest number of applications for asylum to the UK are from people who come from places known to be experiencing the kinds of situations where persecution is likely to occur. So that is contexts of widespread human rights abuses, wars, and civil unrest. Numbers of asylum applications have also been decreasing since the early 2000s in the UK, with a significant 40% dip in the pandemic. Yet the policy approach just sketched out has been taken and regularly intensified. So it's clear that the British state is hostile to people who seek asylum, and that this hostility has been institutionalized and systematized. Sections of the media and large portions of the general public are also hostile to people who are seeking asylum. At the time of the project, most academic researchers took it as a given that the UK and other states would be hostile to people seeking asylum. It was just an underlying assumption. But I wanted really to interrogate how we got there. I wanted to know why, sort of naively at the beginning of that project. And because people who apply for asylum in a foreign country are such a diverse category in every way, in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, nationality, language, and because they have nothing sociologically in common as a group aside from their legal status, literature on refugees at the time had become curiously detached from, or not curiously, had become detached because of these kind of legal facts and that diversity, had become really detached from more sociological questions of things like racism. It's very rare to hear discussion of race and racism in refugee studies at that time. There was some sociology literature which identified hostility to asylum seekers and people like Eastern Europeans as new forms of racism. But that was something understood in a presentist frame and as sort of bad deeds and unkind words, not a deeper structural analysis reaching back into the foundational ideas which make hostility to people seeking refuge seem automatic or inevitable. So in refugee studies, if race was a word that was not engaged with, and really still hardly is, I think, explanations for hostility to people seeking asylum tended to point to things like the unprecedented nature and context of contemporary asylum flows, or the nation state system itself as leading to this seemingly inevitable policy response. But beneath many of the explanations presented for these kinds of asylum regimes at the time were a set of unelaborated assumptions. These assumptions include things like that people understand that non-European people seeking asylum in the UK, but also elsewhere, will be seen as undesirable, even dangerous to the integrity of communities and nation states, that this fact is so obvious that it does not require explanation, that responsibility for non-European people who are seeking asylum, who are thought of as other in some way, is obviously not generally seen to rest with host states, and that irrespective of the circumstances of their flight, some human beings are simply more easily and acceptably degraded than others. And I just really wanted to get to the bottom of these unelaborated assumptions which cut across scholarship and policy making. And in doing that, I drew on three bodies of theoretical literature in the book: postcolonialism, decoloniality, and third world approaches to international law. Now, I know the people who are here in this group are probably all very familiar with post-colonial and decolonial perspectives, but just in case, I wanted to give a very brief simplified overview of how I understand these projects as part of the introduction to my talk. So please bear with me if this is old news to you. So within post-colonial and decolonial studies, colonialism is not simply something that happened and has now ended. Instead, researchers in these fields recognize that colonialism both has many enduring legacies in today's world and in some cases, such as in settler colonial contexts, is ongoing. One of the most important ideas in these fields has been challenging the idea of modernity. So this is the idea that at some point in time, something happened to Western societies which transformed them from pre-modern to modern societies. The Renaissance, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution form the key pillars of this story, together facilitating the Enlightenment, the emergence of democracy, and the rise of capitalism in the West. So these events are commonly considered endogenous to Western societies. So they happened because of the internal specialness and brilliance of Europeans. And they're very rarely attributed to such things as the wealth created by slavery or to the exploitation and subjugation of colonized peoples, industries, and lands. So for postcolonial and decolonial scholars, and there are differences between those two fields, but for the purposes of this aspect, they are similar. This founding narrative of Western modernity, the European miracle, is the often unspoken underlying framework from which research on a multiplicity of topics begins. For these scholars, this is a problem. In this narrative or myth, there are temporal and geographical dimensions to the rupture of modernity. So Europe and the settler colonies are modern and therefore ahead. Other places, indeed whole continents, are represented as traditional or behind. And this idea of the West being ahead in time, with underdeveloped countries representing Europe's pre-modern past, is the temporal aspect. Postcolonial and decolonial scholars have spent a significant amount of time dismantling this narrative. Now, central to this has been understanding coloniality and modernity as inseparable, as two sides of the same coin. So coloniality then referring to a kind of colonial, racially and culturally hierarchical worldview. Modernity then is viewed as an epistemological frame that's inseparably bound to the European colonial project. In other words, as Europeans invented the idea of their societies being modern, so scientifically rational, culturally civilized, democratized, secularized, capitalist, etc., and this being one stage in an inevitable sequence of events, they were simultaneously plundering, exploiting, and impoverishing people in other parts of the world. Logically, then, these other people and the countries which they inhabited came to represent both Europe's opposite in its past, so poor, irrational, uncivilized, incapable of democracy, superstitious, etc. And in some, from these perspectives, this idea of modernity is an idea, not a state of being. It's like a way of looking up in the world, and it goes hand in hand with a colonial worldview. So taking a post-colonial or a decolonial perspective entails not only exploring the tangible material legacies of colonialism, it also, and more often, entails rethinking the foundational assumptions which underlie much social scientific inquiry and asking what the origins of those ways of thinking about the world are. It's about the politics of knowledge production and questioning how we ourselves as scholars may be the living legacies of colonialism when we engage in particular types of academic discussions. So, for those of us that are interested in researching asylum and refugee issues, you can probably, hopefully, see how these kinds of perspectives demand that we take account of the enduring legacies of colonial era power relations. And in doing so, we can potentially get a much deeper, historically grounded analysis of the present. Because although we like to imagine otherwise, the present is rarely unprecedented. So after that very long introduction, this is the structure of my talk. So first I'm going to look at refugee history as told in the contextual backgrounds to research books and papers which deal with the present. Next, I'm going to discuss my research into the 1951 Convention quite briefly, relatively, looking at the context of colonialism. And after that, again, briefly because of time, I'm going to discuss the legacies of colonial ideas, the UK asylum policy in the present. And finally, I'll bring together some concluding thoughts on what it all means. So for the first bit, between 1793 and 1870, there were 3 new pieces of legislation in Britain which dealt with asylum, one of which extended the rights of what we'd now call asylum seekers, and one whose provisions were never actually acted upon. Between 1871 and 1993, there was no new national legislation to deal with asylum seekers or refugees. And just to confirm, these were not periods which did not see the arrival of large numbers of people fleeing persecution. But in the 29 years since 1993, there have been 10 new rafts of primary legislation covering asylum. And in response to this legislation, a large body of academic analysis has emerged, which reports on the poverty and almost total social exclusion which people seeking asylum in Britain experience because of the policies implemented. This includes research on the common incidence of mental health problems, including self-harm, post-traumatic stress disorder and suicide, on arbitrary imprisonment, harassment, hate crime, media witch hunting, and inadequate access to the basic services and resources to which people are entitled. And this is undoubtedly an important body of critical work, and I'm not critiquing this work here, but there is a common thread running through this work, which I do want to critique, and I do critique in the book. It's the accepted historical context to the policy regime, a story which is widely accepted and generally seen to be uncontroversial. So, allowing for variations in individual accounts, the narrative broadly goes like this. The number of asylum seekers in the UK, coming to the UK, to Europe and to other Western countries today is unprecedented. Present-day asylum seekers are unprecedented not only in number, but also in character. They are different from previous cohorts in various ways, including the reasons for their flight and the range of countries they come from. This newness is set within the context of two cohorts of refugees who are often depicted as the original and the genuine, who unequivocally were the intended subjects of the international refugee regime. The first are those displaced within Europe as a result of the Second World War. The second group are Cold War refugees who fled communism in favour of the capitalist West. Other refugees in other parts of the world at the time of drafting the International Refugee Convention, which is where the legal right to asylum in the UK comes from, let alone those before or after, are not a part of this story, not until the 1990s anyway. So once it's been established in this narrative that the Refugee Convention in 1951 was devised in response to European refugees following the Second World War, and that Cold War refugees were small in number and were clearly politically persecuted, the sudden presence of large numbers of non-European asylum seekers at the gates of Europe or within European territories at the close of the 20th century becomes a logical explanation for a tightened policy regime. According to this narrative, these new refugees are different, and there are a lot of them. They also come from poor countries, meaning they implicitly blur the boundaries between economic migrant and refugee, casting doubt on their claim to have been persecuted. This contextual history and explanation is repeated, I should say, by some very excellent scholars whose work is invaluable to the field. And again, I'm not slating their work, but I'm critiquing this dominant framing of the history of asylum. And I give a lot of examples of this in the book, but I'm just going to give a couple typical ones now. So Randall Hansen writes that for much of the post-war period, asylum was a Cold War sideshow. Accepting rare large-scale outflows allowed the West to assert, without much financial cost, its moral superiority. Then in the 1980s, numbers began to increase. After 1989, they exploded. He suggests that despite all effort on the part of European governments to the contrary, numbers of applications remain at intolerably high levels. At the same time, only the most resourceful, generally younger male, can make it to Europe's shores, and they are, by definition, not always the most deserving. Applications for asylum are said to have increased for a number of reasons, including the advent of cheap international air travel and global telecommunications. So Matthew Gibney dubs these jet-age refugees and describes how the economic downturn in the 1980s and 90s meant that fewer foreign workers were required. This meant the closing off of the major avenue through which the denizens of the world's poorer countries could enter the West, thus increasing applications for asylum. What this opened up was the prospect of a truly globalized system of asylum seeking, driven as much by economic disparities between North and South as by refugee generating events, strictly defined. So this narrative, as a generally accepted historical context to the present situation, has really profound implications for how we critically respond to asylum policy and for the challenges that it's possible to make. It sounds logical, right? You know, it sounds like a reasonable, informed explanation. And despite the size, scale, and huge migratory implications of the European empires over 500 years, at this time it was extremely rare to find the words colonialism or decolonization in the index of a book on refugee studies. Perhaps this is starting to change, I'm not sure. So my critique was not so much of what was present, but what was absent in this narrative. And in the interest of brevity, I'm going to discuss 4 silences in this narrative here. So first, silences around non-European refugees before the 1990s. So first, it's striking that displacements outside of Europe, sometimes as a result of colonial activities and struggles around decolonization, as well as the reception of European refugees outside of Europe and the white settler colonies, are not a part of this standard narrative. This is despite the vast exodus from China between 1949 and 50, millions of refugees created by the Korean War, 50 to 53, 700,000 Palestinians becoming refugees during the Arab-Israeli conflict of 1948. That would become one of the most longest-standing refugee crises in history. Experts have estimated that 15 million people were forcibly displaced during the partition of India to create the new state of Pakistan, one of the largest migrations of the 20th century. These refugee crises were raised on a regular basis in the British Parliament in the 1950s, more actually than European refugee issues. And large numbers of refugees were displaced as a result of decolonization, of course, in disputes over borders and sovereignty, which in some cases continue today. It might therefore be assumed that a discussion of the history of refugee policy, at least in Britain, would include some mention of these movements of people, but rarely is this the case. Rather, the literature repeatedly tells us that before 1967, most refugees were European, and international law only needed to change then in 1967 because refugees started to exist elsewhere. What scholars usually mean is that asylum seekers and refugees seeking sanctuary in wealthy Western countries were almost always European in 1951. But 2 vital pieces of information are missing from this representation. First, that the refugee conventions actively prevented non-Europeans from being considered refugees until 1967. And second, that most importantly, just because most refugees in Europe were European in the middle of the 20th century, that does not mean that most refugees in the world were European until the 1990s. This slippage, and I think it's more of a slippage than anything, is vital as it allows for a whole host of assumptions about contemporary non-European asylum seekers to be made. And in the book, I discuss this in relation to Chimney's brilliant work on this phenomenon, what he calls the myth of difference. One key issue with this myth of difference is that people seeking asylum in the contemporary period are then widely described as different from previous cohorts in character and number, even though this is demonstrably not the case. The evidence suggests that people applying for asylum today are migrating not because of poverty, but as a result of the same kinds of reasons as Europeans in the 1930s and 40s, the threat or experience of persecution at the same time as seeking a better life and, you know, a job and all of the normal things that we all hope for. So the second silence now, silences around colonial exclusions from the refugee conventions. Not only were there millions of refugees outside of Europe at the time of drafting the refugee conventions, but non-European refugees were purposefully excluded from these conventions. And I'm not going to talk about this in detail now, because in the next section of the talk, I'm going to talk about that. So I'm going to go on to the third one, silences around the legacies of colonialism for mobility and immobility. So because colonialism is absent from the standard narrative and displacements resulting from colonialism and decolonization in the past are left out of many accounts of the history of asylum policy, It then becomes logical to leave unmentioned the legacies of colonialism for refugee-producing situations, for destination country choice, and for ongoing practices of border control. Colonial practices involved restricting or controlling the mobility of colonized peoples and facilitating the mobility of the colonizers. As the world has become seemingly more mobile through processes related to what we have come to call globalization, it's easy to forget that these same mobilities and immobilities characterize the contemporary period. So as formerly colonized countries, as people have become more mobile, legal and practical barriers have been developed to reinscribe that very immobility, which characterized colonial subjugation. So borders effectively act as filters, and it's much easier for someone with a particular kind of passport to move than somebody with a different national passport, and you often find that correlates with these histories. Okay, so the silences around the legacies of colonialism for ideas of asylum seekers as undesirable and excludable. So what we lose from the standard narrative is that acknowledgement of continuity that a post-colonial analysis necessarily demands. So how can we make sense of the exclusionary impulse without discussing ideas of us and them, which are rooted in colonial history? Colonial histories of racial classification and international political and legal exclusion are deeply implicated in the current mode of operation with regard to people who seek asylum within Britain and many other countries. So for me, a thorough and rigorous account of the context to the rise of this non-entry regime is one which accounts for colonial histories in both the development of the international legal framework for asylum and then the response to more recent cohorts of asylum seekers. Okay, so now in the third section of the talk, I'm going to explore the 1951 convention, though obviously this is still quite brief because of time. So here I'm going to draw on archival research, particularly from British government documents, from the National Archives and on Hansard, and evidence from the UN archives, particularly from the negotiations surrounding the Refugee Convention and the transcripts of negotiation meetings. So human rights discussions are generally really important to the outcome of the Refugee Convention, because the discussions around the broader human rights agenda at that time set the stage, and in many cases, the written precedent on which the outcomes of the negotiations on refugees were based. So that's why I've got to talk a little bit about human rights more broadly at that time. So in the late 1940s, British ministers were initially uninterested and then hostile to any human rights conventions which might place demands on the British state, including those pertaining to refugees. The UN was meant to be, from their perspective, a place for shoring up empire, not for undermining it. The cabinet secretaries' notebooks, so notebooks of private discussions amongst the cabinet ministers from that period, show that there were long discussions between senior British ministers about not wanting to be bound by human rights conventions, but equally not wanting to be seen to be against them. There was a belief that the British had an innate understanding of rights, liberties, and justice, and that this was so intrinsic to the national character, it was not necessary to codify it in law. If there were exceptions to the rule, in the colonies, for example, they were always for the good of people who are not yet able to look after themselves. There was pressure on the government from within, primarily the Foreign Office, to support a European Convention on Human Rights, and that was in the context of Cold War politics. So despite reservations, they determined to be in favour of a European Bill of Human Rights, but for the time being, the government remained privately against a UN convention, because that would have no decipherable benefits and many dangers. And one of the central dangers lay in the colonial question. So the British government were reluctant to sign the conventions if they applied to people in the colonies. As early as 1947, the problems raised by colonial activities within the context of a proposed International Bill of Human Rights were causing concern. So right from the start, ministers were aware that their treatment of colonized subjects would not meet the standard demanded by a concept of rights based on humanity, because in their empire, all humans were not equal. British ministers weren't too concerned about the bill, assuming they could insert an exceptional conditions clause, which could be inserted without too many problems. And such a clause would exclude certain people from rights claims with the justification that exceptional conditions necessitated such action. And those groups to be excluded were, of course, colonial subjects. In April 1951, the cabinet discussion shows increasing anxiety, and there's a lot of these transcripts in the book, but I've just picked up one or two here. A minister says, "I don't know anything about this except that we're in a mess. Started as anti-Soviet propaganda. As it goes on, it looks as though it will put us on the spot, especially regarding the colonies. Colonial application clause is out now by UN vote. We couldn't apply this covenant in the colonies, though politically dangerous for us to withdraw. If we stay in, we might guide discussion usefully. Stay in and make difficulties. It's very difficult for us to walk out. As it stands, without colonial application clause, it's unacceptable to us. We should realize that." So here we can see the tension between the need to maintain an outward image commensurable with willpower status, so high moral standards, and the reality of activities in the empire, and a belief that such activities should continue despite ongoing negotiations of human rights. The colonial application clause referred to here is again the proposal to exclude colonized peoples from access to human rights. So in simple terms, colonial non-application. In March the following year, the discussion appears as follows. Human rights designed to embarrass the Russians has ended up by embarrassing us in the US much more because of colored populations. One covenant signed, this one will surely emerge in a form we can't ratify. We must go on in the knowledge that we will never ratify. Can't ratify anything that involves enforcement. We couldn't reverse engines on enforcement. Very well, let's pursue a policy of steady obstruction by legal quibbles. Anyone who's had any contact with the Home Office will recognize that approach. So at the same time as remaining reluctant to sign a broad human rights convention, which might be applicable to the colonies, the British government was similarly reluctant to include colonized peoples under the rubric of the Refugee Convention. The government publicly argued that non-application of human rights in the colonies was a means of promoting self-determination and democracy there, despite appearing to have the opposite effect. But after some wrangling, actually a rebranded territorial application clause was proposed and passed in the negotiations. So in Article 40, paragraph 1 of the final Refugee Convention document, it states that any state may, at the time of signature, ratification, or accession, declare that this convention shall extend to all or any of the territories for the international relations of which it's responsible. Despite this time holding significant overseas territories, the UK extended the convention only to the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. But of course there was resistance. There's always resistance in these stories. And this was powerfully put at the UN negotiating table. So highlighting this resistance is really important because it shows the fallacy of the myth of difference, particularly the perception that refugees at the time of signing the convention were primarily a European phenomenon, or even that they thought or didn't realize that there were other refugees at the time. This is the other side of the story, and one which sets a critical analysis of the present in a much broader history. So many of the objections to the colonial application clause came from delegations with experience of living under colonial rule and were articulated in terms of anti-colonialism. For example, the Indonesian representative pointed out that if the clause were included in the General Assembly, would in effect be giving a privileged class of human beings the right to decide arbitrarily how far the rights enjoyed unreservedly by themselves could be granted to less favored classes. the Saudi Arabian representative explained the effects of the colonial situation on the problem under discussion. So long as the colonies remained indispensable to the economic survival of the metropolitan powers, those powers could not afford to allow the dependent peoples to enjoy the advantages of instruments like the covenant, which would make them conscious of their rights. There's a lot of these in the transcript, but I've just again selected a few. So the representative of Afghanistan stated that those who claimed they were trying to civilize the peoples whom they were colonizing should at least give them the right to learn how to become conscious of their human dignity. Meanwhile, the delegation from India was strongly opposed to the insertion of the colonial clause, because it was precisely in the non-self-governing territories and in the colonies that the covenant should especially be applied, since it was there that violations of human rights were unfortunately most frequent. So the records of the discussions at the UN of the Convention for Refugees and Displaced Persons in the late 1940s also shows this kind of clear and consistent resistance from some states, all former colonies, regarding an exclusive refugee definition. So it appeared as though the IRO, so the International Refugee Organization definition, and that was an organization that was just for European refugees displaced through World War II, that definition of what a refugee is was going to be used. And people were cross. So in November 1949, the Pakistani representative, Mr. Bukhari, called for a revision of the refugee definition. He pointed out that as defined in the constitution of the IRO, that term only applied to victims of events which had occurred during the Second World War in Europe. After the hostilities, however, other events had taken place in other parts of the world. If the United Nations was to be entrusted with that problem, it should consider them on a worldwide basis. Pakistan had been compelled to receive from 6 to 7 million refugees from various parts of India. More recently, it had given asylum to 500,000 or 600,000 fugitives from Kashmir. In the following meeting, the representative of India noted that although India was not a member of the IRO, it had done its utmost to aid both the UNRRA and the IRO and had helped 6,000 European refugees to settle in its territory after the war, while also coping with its own refugee problem, namely 6 million refugees displaced through partition who had to be looked after and resettled. He hoped the United Nations would acknowledge that India was performing an international as well as a national duty by helping these people, and that it would not be asked to shoulder any further responsibility regarding European refugees. This was followed by support for the Pakistani representative's suggestion that the IRO be maintained and that it address itself to drafting a new convention on the legal protection of refugees everywhere. These objections explicitly highlighted the presence of a hierarchical conception of humanity at work in the negotiations, associated this with colonialism, and challenged it right from the start. Mrs. Roosevelt, who represented the USA and was leader of the Human Rights Commission, replied that the matter required very careful consideration, but ultimately she dismissed the query as the Economic and Social Council had set up an ad hoc committee to review existing conventions, and she assumed it would be dealt with there, so she just was fobbing them off, basically. But the Pakistani representative, who really made many amazing speeches at this time, was not fooled. He welcomed the formation of this committee, but reiterated the fact that if the proposal before the committee were adopted, Pakistan would have to share in financing the legal protection of an undefined number of refugees in Europe, while obtaining no benefits to the millions of refugees in its own country. Indeed, there was no mention in any formal proposal of extending the protection of the new organization to all refugees, and he hoped that some concrete amendments would be submitted in order to allay his anxiety. The Lebanese representative concurred that the draft resolution left out new categories of refugees who did not come under the protection of the IRO, specifying Greece, Pakistan, India, and China as examples. He said it should be possible for the United Nations to extend his services to cover all refugees. At the next meeting, the Pakistani representative again raised the issue of the refugee definition, saying the implication that other categories might be added at some later stage begged the question, what are the categories, or when and how they might be added? It's never been made clear. Iraqi representative Mrs. Afnan expressed full support for the views outlined by the representative of Pakistan, as did the Lebanese representative, and the Iraqi, Indian, Brazilian, and Ethiopian representatives all expressed similar concerns. So resistance was vocal, repeated, and articulated in explicitly anti-colonial terms. For these countries, it was clear that exclusivity in the human rights framework reflected long-held beliefs in a hierarchy of humanity. Their ultimate silencing was not for want of persistently setting out their cases as equals for inclusion in the convention. So I think there are significant implications of highlighting these histories, which are rarely paid sufficient attention in addressing contemporary efforts to limit access to the right to asylum. Not least in foregrounding the longevity of exclusionary asylum practices on the part of Western European states, such as Britain. If exclusions aren't new, then the critical basis of academic scholarship on asylum needs to be revisited. Now, I want to move from this snapshot of 1951 to the present day and look at the way in which asylum seekers are treated in Britain. And I'm going to argue that these logics of differential humanity and deservingness continue to be present despite the fact that in 1967, people outside of Europe did win the right to asylum. Now, it's hard to examine the roster of policy changes introduced in Britain since the 1990s and not conclude that the asylum regime is dehumanizing. If the effect is dehumanization, the underlying rationale of the policies is that the humanity of asylum applicants is something to be respected to the bare minimum of legal obligation, and only where that legal obligation is enforced in the courts. So successive UK governments have sought to decrease the numbers of people who are able to travel to the country to make an application for asylum, and those whose applications are successful, and to minimise numbers that are successful. While this has in part involved border controls, since the early 2000s, it has also included restricting the welfare and working rights of people awaiting a decision on their asylum application. The stated aim of this has been that it's in order to reduce economic pull factors, which are thought to attract disingenuous applicants. And this is part of a shift from construing asylum applicants not as politically persecuted refugees, but as economic migrants in disguise. And this shift occurred as asylum applicants ceased to be understood as white and Soviet, and instead started to be understood as Black and brown and arriving from formerly colonized parts of the world. There's actually no empirical evidence that welfare or work act as pull factors. I've done a lot of research into this, and it's the focus of my recent book, Impoverishment and Asylum. But nevertheless, a series of legislative acts have been passed which have prevented people who are in the asylum system from accessing the labour market, have moved them out of the mainstream welfare benefit system, and have steadily decreased the levels of financial support paid to them. When I was writing the book, the level of support was at $37.75. I think there may have been an uplift in the pandemic, slightly, 80p, I think. That figure, though, is based on what the poorest 10% of the British population spend on essential living items only, and actually was benchmarked at the 2015 level of that and not then increased until the pandemic. This is well below the poverty line. And it's not an accident. Poverty is used as a policy tool to discourage people who might apply for asylum from choosing the UK and encourage those who are here to leave. Last month, the Home Office released a new plan for immigration, which focuses on reforming the asylum system. In this plan, people who arrive in the UK to seek asylum themselves, arrive themselves, rather than from any other means, will not have access to the right to asylum. Only people who are selected from resettlement places, for resettlement places from camps in regions of origin, and a tiny number of people, will have access to the right to asylum. This will be the moment that marks the death of asylum in the UK, as far as I'm concerned. And what will be done with those who do inevitably arrive on these shores seeking asylum? So the first idea was to deport them to France and other countries in the EU. Obviously, France don't want them either. So the next stage of the plan will be an Australian-style offshore detention regime, placing people on disused oil rigs and islands far away while cases are assessed. And I don't have space here to discuss this, but I do want to flag up that this imagined space of the offshore where people can be placed out of sight and where normal rules don't apply is straight out of the colonial playbook. So it's clear then that there is a practical regime of differential humanity operating here, that conditions of impoverishment, harm and endangerment are simply more tolerable for some human beings than others in Britain today. And how do we make sense of this regime of differential humanity? For me, the answer is in the dominance of hierarchical conceptions of human worth. So let us remind ourselves who are the targets of these policies. The main countries of origin, the people seeking asylum obviously change every year with the ebb and flow of displacement-inducing events. But consistently, these are people coming from countries that Britain so determinedly sought to exclude from the right to asylum in 1951. It was at the moment when people seeking asylum became racialized as Black and brown and were coming from formerly colonized countries that they came to be construed not as politically persecuted refugees, but as economic migrants in disguise, as I said before. So when we talk about the legacies of colonialism, this isn't just an academic debate. It's about empirically identifiable practices of human classification and differentiation, which set some apart from others and give rise to unequal treatment. And I guess my concluding remark to finish is that I can't emphasize enough how we can't understand the present without also properly understanding the past. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you very much for the wonderful and intellectually stimulating talk in linking imperialism, colonialism, decolonial and postcolonial theories with studies on migration, studies on refugee and the asylum regime and the asylum process. Thank you. So for the remainder of the time, we would open the floor for questions, comments, and reflections. And anyone who has a question can raise your hands, ask the question, or write your questions or reflections to Lucy on the chat function, and then we will bring them to our speaker. So colleagues, if you have any questions so far, or if anyone would like to come in and reflect on Lucy's talk.
Thank you, Lucy. I think we've got some questions coming up. But before that, if I may ask one question. You also in some of your books talk about this idea of necropolitics, and I just want to understand a little bit more about how this differential humanity is also implicated in creating or producing differential levels of mortality and illegality. And I'm particularly thinking about what's happening in the Mediterranean and also in other places. And yeah, that's basically what I wanted to ask. But I think there are also other questions that we might ask from the audience.
Yeah, so necropolitics is this idea proposed by Kylian Mbembe about it's kind of like the other side of biopolitics, which facilitates and enables the life of citizens through vaccinations and things like that. And necropolitics is like the darker side of that, and the way in which some people are not necessarily then actively killed as outsiders by the state, but are let die or are left in a state of injury. And he was thinking about this in the context of the colony. But I think that we can think about this, I've thought with this productively and thinking about the asylum welfare regime, maintaining people at a level which would be utterly unacceptable for citizens because you're keeping people below the poverty line. And in doing so, we know, of course, that keeping people in a state of poverty is deeply damaging physically to their physical health and to their mental health. So it causes harm and damage and injury in that people are kept in a state of injury. And in the context of the Mediterranean, then of course people are allowed to die. So it's utterly unthinkable that if lots of German and French people were drowning in the Mediterranean, we would remove search and rescue provisions, and that we would then imprison fishermen who rescued these drowning people. It's utterly unthinkable. But these kinds of processes are undertaken to allow people to drown in the Mediterranean and in other contexts. And of course, how can we possibly understand this way in which you could allow people to drown without acting and criminalize life-saving actions in that way, without thinking that some people's lives must be considered by those people making decisions as not of equal value, as not of equally worthy of saving. So other people have written, not me, about the necropolitics in the Mediterranean very beautifully. But I think there's a spectrum of violence, and I was trying to think in that book, Impoverishment and Asylum, about how if one is this kind of very violent, spectacular necropolitics of allowing to drown in seas and deserts and these things, how we could also think about state action to even be giving welfare policy that is meant, welfare provision, which is meant ostensibly to be helping and supporting people, could also be thought about along that spectrum of violence in a necropolitical way.
Thank you, Lucy. We've got a question from our audience, and I think it goes like, if this be considered a kind of a state terrorism, then the kind of the historical setup, the methods and the mechanisms by which the state in fact its policies, if they could be considered state terrorism.
Yeah, thank you to the audience also. It's another one of those strange ones where instead of looking at a group of people, you just have like lots of rectangles in front of you. But yes, hello audience. I assume there are real people there. So I haven't thought about this in relation to state terrorism previously, and I don't know if the person that asked that question would like to speak about the parallels that they see in that. But I suppose in the sense that I think that states like Britain are hoping to do a kind of terrorism in the sense that terrorism seeks to incite terror in people. And so in order to make them act in different ways. So I can see a kind of parallel in that. But at the same time, what the research seems to suggest is that while they hope to incite this kind of terror or disincentive for people to migrate by having these policies, it doesn't actually reduce the number of people who then people don't receive the message in the ways that they hope, and it's border controls that actually stop them from moving or crossing a border, which work. But that kind of message sending, people mainly are focused on fleeing the situations they fled rather than doing a kind of cost benefit analysis of policies in different countries. I can see a couple of hands from real people.
Yeah, we've got a couple of hands and questions. I want to use my privilege and I want to ask a question. If I hope they will forgive me. Mine is a very brief question. The title of your book, it says Asylum After Empire, and I wanted you to touch on your maybe reflection on the question of if we are still in the stage of the after empire stage. Are we in the post-empire stage in terms of how the state, the asylum regime, the refugee regime treats asylum seekers, whether it's in the UK or in other domestic contexts, and in the context of how the structures, methods, and methodologies of dealing and marginalizing asylum seekers and refugees is operationalized. Would we say we are in the after stage of the empire? Do we see any elements of neo-imperial and neo-colonial instruments and tools by which asylum seekers and refugees are treated?
Okay. that's not a little question. But yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, I guess we are after empire in the sense that Britain is not an empire anymore. I really go with Gominda Bambra on this, to not say that Britain had an empire, but that it was an empire. And I think a lot of the crises and things that we're facing now are the Brexit, etc., are the dying throes, the kind of end of empire playing itself out. So in that formal sense of being a structure, but at the same time, obviously, as my talk was about, in the book, I'm interested in thinking about how the colonial logics and worldviews are feeding through into asylum policies. Of course, I suppose the whole point is that we like to think that we cast that aside, but I think that you can't just kind of like start bandying around coloniality without, I think it's really hard, painstaking work of historically pulling through and showing really convincingly how things in the past are happening in the present. And I take sort of 3 moments across history in depth to try and show those logics over time playing out. So yes, I think that's definitely the case. And in relation to neo-colonial tools, I mean, obviously a lot of British aid has been oriented, you know, with the Trust Fund for Africa, etc., to preventing people intervening in various soft and hard ways to stop people from migrating, even in contexts like Kenya, where the funding from the Trust Fund for Africa actually means that the policies they end up pursuing of local integration are contrary to the national refugee policy of moving people on. So it's like even interfering with national policies in order to achieve those aims. I think that we could think about those as neo-colonial in various ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I should give Seta.
Thanks, Lucy. It's great to hear you speak about your really important work, even if it is all virtual. I wondered what your reaction was to the recent calls to decolonize everything. And maybe that's a moment to also talk about your more recent book on migration studies and colonialism. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah. That's another good and big question. So I think it's really extremely important to think seriously and deeply about histories of colonialism, follow through and thread into the present, and have a significant influence over things that are happening now. And I think it's not just about adding new extra histories or perspectives. I think then knowing those histories in some ways changes everything and the whole framework that we would then think about the present. So I think it's really important. In relation to decolonizing everything, I mean, I think it's different in different contexts, I think. I suppose initially when decolonizing became more talked about and popular, I felt pleased, because it was like a very marginal thing to talk about before. And I would really welcome people in different disciplines being interested and committed in thinking about how really key ideas and concepts in the social sciences need to be rethought if we want to take account of colonial histories and think about them in the present, you know, like democracy, humanitarianism, human rights, these kinds of things. I think transformative things need to happen in our disciplines. I think obviously decolonization is like a tool to transform universities in an anti-racist manner is not going to, like, there is no fix, there's no quick fix, there's no list of things we can't just add a few things to our reading list and then everything will be okay kind of thing. I think we need to transform many things on many fronts, but there isn't a word or a fix or a list that's it's just like hard, slow work over many years by many people who no individual, no, you know, and we might sometimes be cynical about our institutions and some of the things they do, but we just have to do the things that we do, what we can from the position we occupy, and sometimes we have to be pragmatic and sometimes we have to be angry and yeah, yeah, that's it, I think, now in this public forum.
Yeah, I think the next question, Lara, do you want to ask your question, or Suad, you can also read it in the chat box?
Yeah, there is a question from Lara.
Sorry, can I just say one thing? I just realized that, is it Seta asked also about the book in that context. Yeah, so I recently did a book with Joe Turner on migration studies and colonialism, and that was partly because people were, especially early career researchers and PhD students, whose like supervisors in migration studies and refugee studies and things were not interested in these things, were always like asking me for reading lists and things after talks like this. So we thought, let's put all this literature that we think is amazing and really important in one place, and then we've done it, sort of thing. We purposefully didn't call that decolonizing migration studies because we didn't feel that it was our place to decolonize something that has, I don't know, been made and originated out of sort of Western universities, and often with an interest in quite colonial ways of thinking about things, but we wanted to like facilitate an engagement with those kinds of ideas. Yeah. Okay, sorry, to the next question.
Very important. The next question is from Lara. Can it be argued that migrants before, example, British in Australia, were not distressed due to political event, and their denial of present asylum seekers seems to be a forgetting on how the European arrive in Australia in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the Australian on the Australian nation and its whole history. I think, but my uninformed observation would be that, like many settler colonies and former colonial metropoles, there is a very conscious and active forgetting of our past, and that past and the forgetting of that past and the narrative of the nation that is afforded by that forgetting allows for a kind of white nationalism which is deeply exclusionary. So yes, that's certainly the case, and certainly Australia is somewhere that's relatively isolated geographically and also large, has had obviously one of the worst records on human rights, on the right to asylum, with their offshore detention policies and pushbacks and everything. So they're really at the forefront of this kind of activity. Perhaps there's somebody in the audience who is an expert in Australia if they wanted to say anything. I don't want to overreach.
Yeah,
good. If we have anyone who would like to join us.
Yeah, you can raise your hand and talk. But I will invite Georgia to ask the question. Can you hear us, Georgia?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thanks so much, Lucy. I feel like I could ask you for insights on various topics all day, but I'll limit to one question, which is relating to the powerful statements around the drafting of the 1951 Convention, and what kind of now how we can reflect on that, thinking about the push by UNHCR to encourage ratification of the convention by states that haven't, and that there is a resistance or a pushback which comes from this place of the fact that their views weren't taken into account previously, and then it doesn't necessarily reflect the context of forced migration that they're experiencing and interacting with. And so one reading is that this is a post-colonial resistance to having this convention imposed upon them. Another is that it's a convenient way to dodge responsibilities. And I'm sure that Hiab and Tesfalam are used to that. The Eritrean government does this all the time in terms of this is a decolonial position or an anti-colonial position, not to sign up to international conventions. But other states kind of resting on that discourse. So I wondered what your reflections, whether you have any reflections on this coming back round in the discourse of why states don't ratify it now.
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue. And obviously I was coming at all of this trying at the beginning, like this started off as my PhD, and I came at the beginning from this particular perspective of like, what are we doing in Britain? Like, just what are we doing and why would we think, why are these things in our name and things like this? So I was thinking from that position primarily. And so, yeah, again, partly this is outside of what I've been doing in this project, but I think, and so I don't want to kind of overreach and speak for like massive swathes of countries across the world. But I think certainly if you think with these histories and the history of the negotiation of the convention, obviously, as you say, it sheds a really different light on people, on countries not wanting to sign up to the convention. It gives a very different light from a sort of the perspective that may be popularly represented of human rights abusers or not wanting to sign up to conventions because baddies or something in some way, to taking a position. I think in spite of the fact that we have these conventions, like as we know, and you know, most refugees in the world are not being hosted in countries that are signed up to the convention or the protocol. And countries that are not signatory to them are, you know, what is the percentage of the population in Lebanon that is refugees, at least at the height of the 2015 Syrian crisis? I think is about 25% of the population. So they are very much doing the heavy lifting and kind of bearing that responsibility. And I don't think I've formulated a view of whether they should sign up to the convention or not, but I think I would just say, as you indicated, that these histories do shed a really different light on this. And I'm doing some work from the autumn on the 67 protocol and the role of other regional conventions like in the African Union, and kind of precipitating that and the kinds of events that around it and the debates and things. So I think I might learn a lot more about the views of non-signatory states to these kinds of things through that project.
Thank you. Suad, I think we have a question. Khaira or Suad, can you check from?
I think there was one question related to the reader list that you spoke about, where they can. The participant is asking about the location where they can.
Oh yeah, no, that was just the book Migration. It's called Migration Studies and Colonialism. In the context of academic books, it's not that expensive. I think it's like £15. But yeah, that was a kind of often being asked for reading lists and things. So that the book was kind of came out of a sort of, right, I'll do it and then it's done sort of thing.
Yeah, we've got another 3 minutes. Khaira, do you mind reading out some of the comments as well? I think we've got one comment there.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. There's a comment from Kikili. I hope I pronounced the name right. She said the people being left to drown, top excluded and rationalized people. Anti-migrant sentiment and race are deeply linked, but there is such a resistance to name racism.
Yep, I didn't hear that very well, so I'm just going to quickly. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think Kekeli, is it? Yeah, I think that is so true. And I think when I was starting to do this work, I was just so surprised even, and this is maybe something in kind of activist things that end up being organized around human rights in a kind of race blind way, but also academics. That was the kind of partly my frustration at the beginning of a kind of legalistic approach, and getting all the books I could find in the library at the university on refugees, and going to the index and looking for kind of like race, racism, colonialism, decolonization, just these kinds of themes that I thought like this has got to be related, and failing to find that. So I think it's a widespread issue, but then it's obviously intuitively so obvious that anti-migrant sentiment and race, as you say, are deeply linked. And I don't know if more recently with Black Lives Matter and general, even the decolonization discourse and general discussion of racism in society, whether there becomes whether those things become more speakable. But Alana Lentin and Eduardo Bonilla Silva have both written really well on the kind of post-race discourse where we say that that's all in the past and it's not really relevant now. I feel like something's turning at the moment, but I don't know if I'm just in a little bubble of people that think the same things as me, so which could be the case. But yeah, you just make a really good point. In summary, I totally agree with you.
I think we have gone another 2 minutes.
Can I, if we don't have any questions or comments from the audience, maybe if I can ask one final question. Okay. In your initial, I think we've got, so do you want to come?
Yeah, go ahead, you can go first.
You talked in the first talks, Lucy, you talked about the intellectual apprehensions and discouragements that you encountered when you first set out and in your project in the first years. And I wonder if what your reflections are over the last few years, then if there has been change in terms of accepting, understanding, and openness to conversations and discussions to this critical historical, intellectual, epistemological aspects of studies. Has been any change over the years, and what is the direction?
Yeah, definitely. I think there definitely something has happened in the past 2 to 3 years. I think probably with the discussions around decolonization, I mean, genuinely people would be just absolutely baffled that I would be messing around with this kind of like academic indulgence, theoretical, historical, it's like people are drowning, don't you know? Stop like going to archives and things. And I think now, because of social movements and because of resistance, and I think there's just been a space opened up to say, obviously there now is the kind of it's all too fashionable backlash, as I mentioned, but I think that it's positive that a space has been opened up. Like when I was publishing Asylum After Empire, I was like, my PhD, you just do a book, you've got to do a book, but I know that no one will read it, and I want to go and do some research now that somebody might be interested in. And then maybe 2 years after it was published, I suddenly started getting lots of invitations to talk about things, and people saying it was interesting and important and things, and you contacting me. And so I think there is a shift. I don't know if that's within the kind of mainstream of refugee studies, but certainly within the sort of more kind of like a critical aspects. It just seems strange, doesn't it? Not to just look at this massive global history and say, oh, maybe that's got something to do with what's going on now. Let's look into it. I don't think it's unreasonable or radical even.
Thank you.
Very fastly.
Suad?
Just quickly, so I was really interested in the way that you brought different things together, like the theoretical lens with the historical context to look at the different perspective on refugees from different contexts. So my question is really on the analytical frame, the analytical tool that you used. What kind of tools did you use? Was it like CDA, critical discourse analysis, or frame analysis, and how it allowed you to kind of bring all these things together? I'm sure like there are other PhD students who would love to see the connections between the policies on how they might be inherent in the colonial legacies. So what are your recommendations?
So one thing to say to PhD students is that you don't just formulate a way of presenting your whole book, your whole thesis, one day in the first time that you draft it. You know, I published the book in 2017 and I've given loads of talks about it. So you start through trial and error and practice and thoughts and consideration and reflection over a long time. You start to formulate a way to articulate it and understand it on different levels. I think it's not like a fast, like there's a magic trick. Within this actual study, so it's a historical sociology where I did a kind of, I think it's called a diachronic analysis, where you pick historical moments and then you find patterns across them, and you and I looked at, and I worked a lot with institutional orders. So thinking about institutional orders of strange bedfellows, they're often called in that literature. So kind of amalgamations or coalitions of people working together, either to maybe, for example, shore up colonialism or to challenge it, or kind of different moments. So in the case of the 1951 convention, that kind of historical moment, there was a coalition of people challenging this exclusionary regime, and a coalition together trying to protect and make it exclusionary. So I thought of that in terms of institutional orders and drew a lot on the literature on institutional orders from historical sociology and political science, just as a way, like I think that the analytical tools that you use, you can't sort of decide them and impose them. You have to find the tools that are going to help you understand the data that you have and analyze it well. And I sort of came to that through the process of having these large bodies of archival and historical and diverse types of evidence that I'd amassed across these three moments. I started with the abolition of slavery and went up to 1951. So it was like a kind of daunting task and at that time, there wasn't a lot of examples. So I just kind of assembled this collection of tools that would allow me to think across moments in time and then in depth within those moments. I think in the book there is a section, I'm sure I didn't delete all the methodology PhD bits, and I did keep the explanation of how I went about it somewhere.
Thank you. And with that, I think we can conclude our talk today. So again, thank you very much, Lucy, for the excellent talk. We've got really lovely comments as well. Thank you everyone for your contributions, comments and questions. Thank you. Hope we will see you for our next seminar series. Thank you very much.
Thanks for organizing this series. It's really enjoyable for me to watch.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.